Hi everyone, happy weekend. Corie here, and we are about to do the chapter recap of our assigned reading from Bible Discovery, the Discovery Guide, and Bible Discovery TV. We're aiming to get you caught up or just solidify in your mind space what you have read and studied this week in the scriptures. So we are covering Ezekiel chapter 21 to 39. So a lot of prophecy, essentially, because remember, Ezekiel was a Judean exile living in Babylon before the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jerusalem temple. So last weekend, we took a look at some of his wilder visions, I would say, especially of the presence of God, this moving throne of God, and he's been taken, to Jerusalem, to the temple. So today, we are going to continue with his visions. So Ezekiel chapter 21. So in this chapter, it's talking about how Babylon specifically, this Neo-Babylonian empire, is going to be used as a sword of judgment against Judah. So this is nothing new. It's just a recurring theme, not only in Isaiah and Jeremiah, but here in Ezekiel. So Ezekiel goes into specifics how King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon will be marching, on his way to wage war. And he's going to come to a fork in the road, and he's going to use various sources, various kinds of Babylonian divination. And this is described in the chapter. But the result of this divination, he's trying to choose between going and attacking Ammon, the Ammonites in their capital city of Rabbah, or whether to march to Judah and the Judean capital of Jerusalem. And all of the divination is surprisingly, I guess it's going to be surprising to them, point towards Judah and Jerusalem. So that's where he's going to go. There's also this undercurrent theme in the chapter of how Zedekiah, the current king of Jerusalem, the priests, and the city itself will have to take off their turban, their crown, basically their authority. They're not fit to lead the people of Judah any longer. I guess they've never been fit to do it, but at this point, God's saying, you're done now. You're done. Take off the crown, take off the turban. Ezekiel chapter 22. So this is about how God has reached the end of his patience, the end of his frustrating relationship with Judah. The kings of Judah and all of their moral failures are discussed. There's this picture of the kings and the priests leading the people into sin, and the prophets just whitewashing it all with false promises and visions and prophecies. So we've got this, triforce of power that should be used for good. It should balance each other out. If the king starts to go evil, the priest should correct him, and so should the prophets, and vice versa. But they're all bad, and none of that is happening. Ezekiel chapter 23. This is a pretty graphic and, quite frankly, terrible chapter. The point of this chapter is that Israel's and Judah's dependence on the nation of Egypt is a personal insult to God. He's taken this personally. And how this is portrayed in this chapter is it's personal as adultery is a personal offense to the spouse who is being cheated on. So he makes it really, really personal in this chapter. So he also talks to Judah and Israel about how, you've actually ceased being a spouse and you are now a prostitute. That's how far you have gone into your adultery. And your lovers, at least in an adulterous affair, there's some relationship between the two people who are committing adultery, though it's evil. But you're like a prostitute because you don't even have any relationships to your lovers. This isn't benefiting you at all. They're not even paying you. You're even worse than a prostitute. And in fact, your lovers are going to destroy you. It talks about how Samaria, meaning northern Israel, that's their capital city, was really bad, but how Judah has taken it to the next level. They're even worse and will also be destroyed just as Samaria was destroyed. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 24. So God gives Ezekiel a prophecy to act out. So this is another one of those physical prophecies, and It happened on the very day that Jerusalem began being besieged by Babylon. So God has Ezekiel put a copper cooking pot on a fire and build up the fire around it. The cooking pot is filled with water. Bring it to a boil and put like really choice pieces and cuts of meat in the pot and let it cook. And then take the meat out, kind of without choosing, just go in and take that meat out as it's cooking. Then let this empty, kind of gross, meaty, remnant, leftover pot cook on the fire until it glows and burn off all of the dirt, burn off all of the impurity, and even get rid of that water. So this is a symbol about how the city, the people being the meat, the people are going to be removed from the city. They're going to be cooked and removed, and the city itself is going to experience that judgment of God, that heating up in the fire until it glows so that it can be cleansed of its sin through destruction. Also in this chapter, Ezekiel's wife dies. God tells him in advance, your wife is going to die. But God does not allow Ezekiel to go through the traditional mourning practices, which were all external. So things like rending your garment, so tearing your clothes, putting sackcloth on instead of your regular clothes, which would be like a rough loincloth, covering yourself with dust and ashes, sitting out publicly in the street, mourning and singing laments, that kind of thing he wasn't allowed to do. He was told to weep and to mourn internally. And this was a sign, because it would have been quite shocking to the society around him, to the people around him. And they're going to ask, like, why are you doing this? And it's because the delight of their eyes, which was Jerusalem and the Jerusalem temple, would also be destroyed, and they would not be able to mourn outwardly, but would have to mourn inwardly. And later on, we learned that Ezekiel actually, wasn't able to speak after this. He completely took some sort of vow of silence. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 25, these contain prophecies against enemy nations of Judah. So Ammon, Moab, Edom, and Philistia. So Ammon is going to face judgment because basically you rejoiced when Judah fell, so your judgment is coming. To Moab, if you boil it down, it's just that they joined forces against Judah, so they are going to be judged as well. Edom looked at their destruction as an opportunity to take revenge, to attack, the Judean people as they tried to run away from the Babylonians. The Edomites captured them and killed them. So they would face judgment. And then Philistia is just generally hostile to Judah, so they're going to face judgment as well. Ezekiel chapter 26, this begins a section where God gives prophecies about the city of Tyre. It's going to last for 3 chapters. And Tyre was a very important port city in the ancient world. And it was actually 2 cities. There was a mainland city and then one out on an island just offshore. So it was a really difficult city to take completely because how do you take a walled island city? Not easily is the answer. Not easily. So in Ezekiel chapter 26, it talks about how Tyre saw the fall of Jerusalem as an opportunity for more trade. We already control the sea. Now maybe we can control this central territory in the ancient Near East so we can expand our trading empire. It prophesies the total destruction of Tyre. It prophesies the success of Nebuchadnezzar. So historically, Nebuchadnezzar defeated the mainland city of Tyre, but he was not able to take the island city. That island city would actually survive until the time of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC or BCE. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 27, this is a lament over the city of Tyre. So there's a description of how great and marvelous she was, the amazing building materials that were used, all the craftsmen and the technology, the skill of the sailors and the merchants, the diverse places that she did business with. It just gushes over, how awesome she was. There's lists of goods that were imported and exported and traded through the cities of Tyre. And the chapter concludes with, like a ship in a storm, which people from Tyre would definitely understand that, being a port trading city. You will be shipwrecked, just like a ship in a storm, and the merchants will mourn over you. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 28. This is really interesting because it's used in a few different ways. It's interpreted in a few different ways. This is essentially a prophecy against the king of Tyre. So there's this description of the pride of the city of Tyre and the pride of the king. And God's response to that pride is, you think you're a god, but you are going to die like a mortal man. So your death will reveal that you are mortal. You're going to die in battle. So in a prophecy addressed to specifically the king of Tyre, Ezekiel uses Genesis creation language, so symbolism, imagery, talks about the king as a cherub, like a cherubim, that Ezekiel has interestingly already described as those 4 living creatures with the 4 faces and the 4 wings. If you go back to last week, you'll be able to hear about that. So the king as a cherub in Eden. And the fall of Tyre is compared to, the sin of Satan and the sin of mankind, which is trying to be like God, trying to replace God. So because of this, some people take this to be a prophecy that reveals Satan's original sin, and that it's God directly talking to Satan, or perhaps talking to the spirit behind the king of Tyre. And that's possible. The other option is that it reflects a physical reality, but it's using symbolism to typify what's going on here. So this is like when, right? So it's more imagery here. That is the other option. It's showing that this sin, this pride, has happened before. In fact, it's the oldest story in the book. It's the same thing. The sin of pride is devastating, and it's repeated by all fallen creatures. That's kind of the other essence that we get from it. So at the very end of this chapter, the city of Sidon, which is often, a sister city with Tyre, makes an appearance, and she too will fall, is the essence of that. All right, Ezekiel chapter 29. We're moving right along. It is an intro to a long section dealing with Egypt. So Tyre is over, and now Egypt. And there's, chapter 29 to 32 is dealing with Egypt, this place that Judah and Israel leaned on for help and made an alliance that God saw as an abomination, as a personal affront, because they should have been resting in him. So Pharaoh is envisioned as a great monster lying in the streams of the Nile. So this is probably referring to the great Nile crocodile, and this crocodile, this Pharaoh, will be caught and brought into the desert. He will die in the desert. So the claims against Egypt is that they've been a false friend to Judah and Israel. These people have depended on Egypt and only end up hurt. Egypt will be taken captive for 40 years as Judah would be taken captive for 70. So Egypt would be taken captive for 40 years and then will be brought back to their land, but they will never rise to the same kind of power that they had before. So they're going to be exiled under Nebuchadnezzar, and like Israel, they're going to be released when Cyrus, king of Persia, comes to the throne. So it's also mentioned that because Nebuchadnezzar didn't get the amount of spoils of war that he wanted from the city of Tyre, because he was only able to take over that mainland city, he will take all of that loot from Egypt. Ezekiel chapter 30 contains a lament for Egypt. Just as there was a prophecy against Tyre and then a lament for Tyre, the pattern is repeated here in Egypt. A prophecy against Egypt and now a lament. And this lament talks about how it's going to fall to Babylon, be scattered, including the Judeans who fled there against the messages of God, right? So this goes back to the book of Jeremiah, where Jeremiah tells the surviving Judeans, don't go to Egypt, and they do it anyway. Ezekiel chapter 31. So the nations of the earth here, the nations of the ancient Near East, are compared to great trees like the trees in the Garden of Eden. So this is a theme that Ezekiel likes to use, isn't it? He likes to use creation language to talk about the current situation in the world. Maybe because it felt like the world's political order was being recreated. I don't know, but this is what he uses. So Egypt is called the greatest of all of these trees, yet it will be felled, it will fall, it will be cut down, and animals will take up residence in its fallen form, in this fallen tree, this fallen body. So essentially, this is talking about how Egypt will still be inhabited, but it won't reach the glory of the great tall tree that it was before. It's still going to be a home, but it's not going to be a standing up amazing tree of Eden. It's a fallen tree of Eden, not like its former self at all. Ezekiel chapter 32, this is a lament over the Pharaoh of Egypt specifically. So it talks about, again, how you are like a lion, you are like a monster of the seas and stream, so probably, again, that Nile crocodile. And the people will catch you in a net, and they're going to throw you on land in an open field, and you know, in no uncertain terms, this is going to be the end of Pharaoh. So there's a lot of apocalyptic imagery in Ezekiel chapter 32. And this is meant to tell us that this is absolutely the end. This is the Pharaoh's apocalypse. This is his ultimate end. The sun is covered with a cloud and the moon doesn't give its light. So you've got darkness and blood. These themes that are found in all of the apocalyptic literature. Think Daniel, think later on in Ezekiel, think Revelation. It all ties in here. So there's also this vision of Egypt going down to the realm of the dead, where all the other great conquered nations are waiting to greet her. And there's this really interesting description contrasting people who die in battle versus people who die in times of peace. So I want to read that to you. It's verse 27. But they do not lie with the fallen warriors of old. So the Egyptians do not lie with the fallen warriors of old, who went down to the realm of the dead with their weapons of war, their swords placed under their heads and their shields resting on their bones, though these warriors also had terrorized the land of the living. So this is talking about the kind of death that everyone wanted. They wanted to die in a time of peace when their bodies and their memories are able to be honored with that burial. They're buried with their weapons. It's all very glorious and you know, about honor, right? But Egypt's going to be like the many nations that didn't die in times of peace and therefore were honored by their people. Instead, they're going to be killed in a bloody takeover. So they're not going to get that honor. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 33. This is about Ezekiel's responsibility as a watchman. This has already been brought up by God in the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, but here it is again. This idea that Ezekiel is responsible for warning the people. He is responsible for delivering the messages of God, but he's not responsible for what the people do with that message. So Ezekiel, you have to tell them, because if you don't tell them, their blood is on your hands. But you're not responsible for their decision-making process. So you just tell them the truth, and they'll do with the truth what they want. There is a call to Israel that all is not lost, even in destruction, that God wants to save them. They must turn from their evil ways. Also, we learn that the people are accusing God of being unjust in this situation, but the message is that it's actually them that are being unjust. They need to switch their mindset. So the fall of Jerusalem is announced here in Ezekiel chapter 33, and this comes with freedom for Israel. It comes with freedom for Ezekiel. He hadn't been allowed to speak since the death of his wife. He was mourning inwardly. So at this point, he's released and he's able to speak. And God summarizes the sin of the people in this way. He says, you eat meat with the blood still in it. This is significant because it means you don't respect life. Remember, that was the Jewish teaching, that life is in the blood. And so when they were to eat animals, they were to spill out all of the blood as a respect for this idea of life and sacrifice, but also as an act of respect to God, the giver of life. The next thing, you look to your idols and shed blood. So you don't respect or serve God. Even though you say you serve God and respect God, you can't serve two masters. You can't serve idols and God. You rely on your sword is the next accusation. So they were relying on their own strength, their strategic and, physical power rather than relying on the word of God. Another thing, you do detestable things. So they're breaking the law, the covenant law of God, and you defile your neighbor's wife. So there's this idea of evil against others. And then God says, should you then possess the land? With the obvious answer, no way. Verses 30 to 33 is a little bit, I'm just going to read it to you and we'll talk about it after. As for you, son of man, your people are talking together about you by the walls and at the doors of the houses, saying to each other, come and hear the message that has come from the Lord. My people come to you as they usually do and sit before you to hear your words, but they do not put them into practice. Their mouths speak of love, but their hearts are greedy for unjust gain. Indeed, to them you are nothing more than one who sings love songs with a beautiful voice and plays an instrument well. For they hear your words, but do not put them into practice. When all this comes true, and it surely will, then they will know that a prophet has been among them. This is so depressing. The people were looking at Ezekiel as a form of entertainment. We do this today. This is such human nature. It's so easy to become guilty of listening to pastors and preachers and apologists and even reading the Bible for entertainment's sake, as intrigue, But we have to ask ourselves, is it just entertainment? Or are we actually putting the things that we're learning into practice? Are we living for God, or are we just listening to a bunch of people talk about God so that we feel really holy or we feel really righteous? It's something to really self-reflect about. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 34. This is against the shepherds of Israel, again, against the leaders. It accuses them of getting all the benefits of being a shepherd, like wool and meat and things of that nature, but not actually leading the sheep or taking care of them. So you're just pretending to be a shepherd and slaughtering them when it suits your fancy or your benefits. So it talks about how God will retake the role of the shepherd of Israel himself, and he will bring justice. He's going to give judgments between the sheep. So because apparently there's some fat sheep and then there's lean sheep. There's sheep that are bullying the other sheep and taking all their sustenance, and the shepherds aren't doing anything about it. That was the shepherd's job. Bring justice. Make sure there's equality. But that's not happening. So God's going to do it himself. And he talks about how the servant David will be placed over the sheep. So this is a messianic prophecy. There is the dynasty of David will resurface. Ezekiel chapter 35. This is against Edom again, but in this chapter it's called Mount Seir. That was just another way of saying Edom. And again, it's this idea that Edom was in a treacherous relationship with Judah, and they saw the Assyrian and then the Babylonian advances as opportunity for them to take more territory. And God says this to them: since you did not hate bloodshed, bloodshed will pursue you. So that's a pretty stark warning. Ezekiel chapter 36. God has Ezekiel prophesy to the barren land of Israel and Judah, the uninhabited parts. We know some parts were still inhabited, but the uninhabited places and towns and mountains, about how they will once again, one day, be filled. They will be rebuilt. They will be homes for people and animals and crops. It will go from being a scorned and ridiculed landmass to one that provides, that fulfills its purpose of provision and sustenance. It looks forward to a time when the people are back in the land and God gives them a heart of flesh to replace their hearts of stone. And it talks about how God's Spirit will be placed inside of the people so that he can move them, he can convict them into following him, and they can live for him. Which sounds really familiar when you get into the New Testament. So remember that. Ezekiel chapter 37. This chapter is wild. This is the famous chapter of the Valley of Dry Bones. Ezekiel goes in this vision to a valley filled with old, dry, very dead human bodies, just the bones. And God has Ezekiel prophesy to the bones. And as he's prophesying, the bones begin to come together, and flesh, like tendons and muscles and ligaments and skin, it all comes together, but they still aren't alive. It's just this whole valley now of just dead bodies that aren't rotted or anything like that. And then God has Ezekiel prophesy to the breath, to life, to the life of God. And as he does, the bodies become alive. And then the vision is interpreted for us. Israel has said, we're basically dead, we're buried, there's no hope, it's gone. But God will open the tomb of the Babylonian and Assyrian captivity and bring them back to the land of Israel and revive them. They're not going to stay dead, right? This goes that God's going to put his spirit, his breath in them, right? They're going to be one nation again as well. So Israel and Judah, they were split into the two nations before the captivity. They're going to be one nation again. And to prophesy that, Ezekiel has two sticks. On one, he writes belonging to Judah and the Israelites with him. And on the other, he writes belonging to Joseph, which is Joseph's son Ephraim, is how the northern Israelites were referenced. So that's what that's about. And then he joins the sticks together in one hand, symbolizing that. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 38. 2 more chapters left. This is a future prophecy about opposition to God's people, opposition to Israel. So it talks about Gog, the prince Gog from the land of Magog. He's also the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. Meshach and Tubal were north of Israel, kind of the area of Turkey today. It describes how a great alliance of nations will try to invade the newly settled, peaceful, and prosperous Israel. However, God will protect the people and the many nations that are living in the Holy Land with Israel. And his purpose here is he's going to set up his presence and a messianic kingdom. So the chapter ends with a great earthquake that will be devastating to the invading army, to this invasion of Gog. Ezekiel chapter 39 continues on with this theme. There's not really a natural break here. It just continues on. So there will be a great defeat of Gog's armies. And, you know, it talks about how the devastation will be so great that it's going to be a feast for the carrion birds, like vultures and things of that nature. There will be an entire valley that's dedicated to burying the bodies. That's how great the devastation of this army will be. It'll take 7 months of body recovery to bury them all. And then even more time afterwards, the people of Israel and the nations that are with them are going to have to sweep through the battleground, because their purpose will be to cleanse the land. So they're going to flag any little human bone or body part that they find, and then other people will come behind and, you know, systematically take those and give them a proper burial. So this idea of respect for life, even of your enemies. The people of Israel will know as a result of this that God is absolutely God, and the rest of the nations will have this amazing witness to that fact as well. So the overall theme of Ezekiel 38 and 39 is that God will always protect, provide, and judge. So now and in the future, and in their context as the Babylonian exiles, now and in the future, they would have been in this place of uncertainty, even when we get released back into the land. This is just going to keep happening. Israel is a coveted land. It's right in the middle of trade routes. How is this going to happen? So God is promising that now and way off into the future, towards the Messianic kingdom, he will always protect and provide for his people. So that's it. That wraps up Ezekiel chapter 21 to 39. If you have any questions, because I know there are some wild chapters in there, pop them in the comment box below. And I hope you have a good week. See you later.